to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to introduce to you a very important topic, and that is how and when and why would we want to open files. And in this particular case, we will be talking about with very concrete benefits. Let me right away show you the first example of this lesson. Here we go. As usual, the first thing, let's establish who is doing better just purely by material. If you look at the position, you'll see that white has a rook and a knight, but black has both his rooks. So that in itself gives already black a 2-point material plus. In addition, black does have 2 extra pawns as well. So in total, black is 4 points ahead, which is obviously a very big advantage. And in addition to all of that, the white rook is under attack at this moment. Now, what we need to recognize is that if the white rook, the one that's being attacked, would have wings and could fly over that white knight right in the middle of the board, then the white rook would checkmate right on d8. But as we know, the rook does not jump over pieces unlike the knight does, and therefore that would be illegal to do that right away. So therefore, we need to try to find a creative way to get our knight out of the way. The challenge is, if right now white simply moves the knight away, for example, threatening to checkmate on the following move, then the black pawn will capture the white rook before that checkmate would ever arrive. So, let's go back and see what we can do. We need to do a forceful move, which means that we'll not give black the time to capture our rook. Typically, those moves are a check, sometimes a capture. Well, in this particular position, white has 2 such options. White can give a check with a knight either on b6 or by capturing the pawn on c7. Let's see if knight captures pawn would work. Out of this check, black has no choice but move the king, and in fact that is a good choice for black, because now if the white rook would come down to check, the black king could just capture the knight. So this does not quite work either. Going back to the starting position, we know now the answer. The knight needs to go to b6. Even though this is a sacrifice because the black pawn or rook could capture the knight or the king move out, and regardless which is black's choice, the checkmate arrives. And this is called a back rank checkmate, which we have touched on some of the previous lessons. Let's move on to our second example in this lesson. And in this position, the situation is quite similar. White has his queen, but black has certainly some compensation. Black has an extra rook and 2 bishops, which adds up to being 11 points, which equals to white's extra queen and 2 pawns, 9 plus 2. So materially speaking, purely at the moment, there is balance. However, at this very moment, the white queen attacks the black bishop and pawn at the same time. Sadly for black, if black would choose to retreat the bishop, to move the bishop away from the attack and to protect the pawn on g6, that would not be a wise idea, because the white queen would just capture the bishop, and that would be quite a serious gain. Looking further onto the position, it's important to notice that the white king could almost be checkmated. Again, if that black rook would have the opportunity to jump over the bishop on f4 and move to f1. But as we know, it cannot. So again, we need to look for a move that moves the black bishop out of the f file So then the black rook indeed could come down to f1 and checkmate. Again, similarly to the previous example, black does not have the time to quietly move his bishop out of the way, because on one hand, white would be able to open an escape square for the white king, and even more painfully, white would have the time to capture black's bishop with a check, and therefore this would be really sad for black. Again, what black needs to do is, even if it costs him a bishop, but as long as he accomplishes the ultimate goal, that is to checkmate, to let the bishop out of the way with a check. And that move is moving the bishop to e3. And now again, regardless whether the king moves out of the check or white captures the bishop with either the pawn or the queen, black would accomplish the ultimate goal, which would be checkmate. This is another reason that explains why it's so important to familiarize yourself with different checkmate patterns, because in a way they keep repeating themselves. Like this is a different version of a back rank checkmate because a black bishop is aiding the rook in accomplishing that. In our first example, the rook accomplished it all by himself. So nevertheless, the more checkmate patterns that you are familiar with, the better chances you have to trick your opponent, because as you get to play more experienced players, they will not fall for just a very simple threat in one move. However, it's much more likely that you'll catch them when it's hidden, like it was here. You had a bishop in the way and you had to get rid of that bishop. So the threat wasn't immediate, but it was in the picture, and black here could accomplish it by force, not giving white a chance, and it's much easier to fall for a hidden trap than for an obvious one. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, materially speaking, black has a major advantage. If you look carefully, you'll notice that black has 2 rooks while white only 1. And there is no piece that white would have more of than black. Black in addition has an extra pawn too. So it's in a higher level, unless there is something concrete, which there is in this case, white would already resign in such a situation, because the situation seems so hopeless. However, at a beginner level, I suggest you play out your games fully and take advantage of the opportunities that your opponent may open up for you. In addition to the material advantage that black has right now, black is offering an exchange of queens as well as of the exchange of the bishops. Either one would bring black closer to winning the game. Whenever you're ahead in material, typically it's to your advantage to exchange more pieces, especially the higher value pieces such as the queen, because typically it will give less and less chances for counterplay for your opponent. Another plus that black has in this position is that the black king seems to be more protected, having 2 pawns right in front of the king, while white only has one of the pawns that typically are there to protect the king. If you look carefully at the situation, already being familiar with the ideas we're looking for from our previous 2 positions in this lesson, we can notice that if the white bishop would be gone from g6, it wouldn't be there. The white queen could capture black's pawn on g7 and announce checkmate, because the white rook on g2 would be supporting the white queen on g7. Again, white does not have the luxury to move the bishop quietly to f5, even though that would attack the black queen at the same time, because black would get the chance to move the queen away with a check, and that would in fact force the trade of the queens. Again, white needs to look for a forceful move, an even more forceful move than attacking the enemy queen. We need to attack the enemy king. Now, Would bishop takes bishop be a good idea? Not quite, because then after black recaptures even with the queen or the rook, either one, both would protect the g7 square, the g7 pawn, and black would remain to be in a winning position. Therefore, again, the correct solution is moving the bishop to h7, giving itself up, and opening the g-file most importantly. Then, whether king captures or just moves to the corner, in either case, checkmate arrives. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, again, black has a significant material advantage, having an extra rook and 3 pawns for white's extra knight, which is a very significant difference, that is black being up 5 points. Hopefully by now you know what to look for, and that is some checkmating idea that almost works if one of our pieces wouldn't be in the way. And with that hint, hopefully you recognized that the knight on g4 is the one in the way. If that knight would be not there, white would be ready to checkmate with the queen capturing the pawn on g7. An important thing to mention is that if that piece is not a knight or a bishop, but it would be a pawn, then it would be rather imaginary, these tactics to work to get the pawn out of the way. As we know, pawns only move straight ahead or capture sideways, but it's very rare that that pawn move could be forceful enough or powerful enough to not give your opponent a chance to defend against the checkmate threat. Typically, it's a knight or a bishop that would have that power to get out of the way with a tempo by either giving a check or in some cases to attack a very strong enemy piece like a queen. In this particular position, as usual, it's too slow to move the knight out of the way to some random square. For one, black would have the time to just play g6 and stop the checkmate that way, but even more painfully, black would capture the white rook for free with a check. So this is certainly not a good choice for white, even though it's thinking in the right direction as of getting the knight out of the rook's way. Now, as of giving checks to the black king, white has 2 options: to check the king from f6 or from h6. Both open the g-file, both are good in that sense. Nevertheless, only one of them accomplishes the ultimate goal. Before you listen further, try to pause and figure out which one is the correct one and which one is wrong and why. The wrong choice would be moving the knight to f6, and the reason for that is, while it's true that the pawn on g7 now is pinned and cannot capture the knight, that after the king moves to h8, now white does not have a good follow-up, because now all of a sudden the knight on f6 is in the queen's way to g7, and therefore black has a winning position now. On the other hand, giving the check from h6 surely accomplishes our goal to checkmate on the following move. The black pawn from g7 cannot capture the knight because that would leave the black king in check, in attack, and that's illegal, leaving black with only one single choice, moving the king to the corner, and then queen captures pawn results in checkmate. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, there is a material balance. While white has an extra bishop and knight, black has an extra rook and pawn, which balances out each other. Black has just offered an exchange of queens by moving the queen to e6. In addition, black is threatening to give checkmate. Hope you see where that is. And that is by moving the queen to e1. We certainly do not want that to happen. But how can white accomplish the goal? By now, I bet you can figure out what we're talking about. We are talking about getting our knight from h5 out of the way. If that knight would not be there, white would be ready to checkmate with the queen on h7. Again, the challenge is we cannot afford a quiet move because, as we said, black is threatening to checkmate on e1. So therefore, white needs to make a forceful move. And we don't even mind to lose our knight for nothing. As long as the following move we will be able to checkmate by queen captures pawn on h7. Therefore, the correct solution is knight to f6 check, and either black piece captures, the checkmate arrives. After all these examples that we just saw, which was clearly from the attacking offensive perspective, I'd like to introduce now a number of examples where we're using the opening of a file, line, or diagonal for defensive purposes. Let's move on to the next example, which is the first one in the series of defensive examples. First of all, the important thing is to recognize what is our opponent's threat. As I always tell my students, the most important thing is after every move of your opponent to be aware what your opponent may want to do next. What did my opponent make this move for? Right now, the white queen has just moved to h7 with the idea to on the next move up to the corner to h8 to checkmate the black king. If black right now would simply open up an escape square on f7, that would not be sufficient because while it would delay or avoid the immediate checkmate, it would result in losing the queen, after which it would be only a matter of time that white would win the game. So what can black do? If the black queen moves, checkmate still arrives. And there is no other way that would actually stop the immediate checkmate threat or winning the queen threat with queen h8. Nevertheless, black has an escape from the checkmate threat. If black in this position would be able to capture white's pawn on d6, that would result in an escape opportunity for the black king. The problem is the bishop on d7 is in our way. Therefore, black needs to make a forceful move, get rid of his bishop, even though black was up a whole bishop in this position. It's a whole lot more important to make sure that you don't get checkmated or you don't lose your queen. You'd rather happily give up your bishop instead. So the correct choice is to capture the pawn with the bishop. Now white is in check, therefore no time to give checkmate. White must respond to the check by capturing the bishop, for example, and then black can capture the pawn on d6, and now after queen h8 the king is free to escape to e7, and it is only black who can win, having the extra pawn. Let's move on to another example. Here we go. In this position, we're seeing a familiar checkmate threat that we already discussed in a previous lesson, where the white queen aims to move to b7 with the help of the pawn on c6, threatening to give an immediate checkmate. Well, what would be black's options here? One would be to counterattack and try to checkmate white's king. But I can tell you there is no such opportunity available at this very moment. Another opportunity would be to directly protect that key b7 square, where the white queen wants to move to. At this moment, black does not have such an opportunity either. And the third option would be if black would be able to capture white's pawn on c6. So those are the three potential opportunities. In this particular case, the only one black can accomplish is to defend the b7 square after a line opening combination. The black queen could guard that key b7 square if the queen could come to c8. The problem again is the queen cannot jump over the rook. So even though black is a whole rook ahead in this position, plus another 2 pawns, black's best choice is to get rid of his rook, give up some of his material advantage to make sure the queen gets to c8. And to accomplish that, the correct move is rook d1 check, and whether the white king captures the rook or not, the next move, the black queen arrives to c8, and black no longer has to worry about the checkmate threat on b7. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Here again, white is threatening to checkmate by moving to g7 or checkmate in 2 moves by capturing the pawn. Black's problem again is that they don't have an opportunity to immediately guard both of those important squares. Again, the problem is the pawn standing in the way, and that gives us a hint. The pawn needs to move forward to open up the retreat of the black queen, and then after pawn takes, on one hand, black is able to retreat the queen all the way to g6 to guard all the key squares, or even better, black can give a fork by moving the queen to f5 and then capture the white rook on the next move. Let's see just a few more examples on the same topic. In this position, white aims to checkmate with rook h8. The problem black faces is that he cannot advance the f-pawn because that is pinned. Try to figure out what is the correct move here for black to stop the checkmate. And that answer is moving the g-pawn, opening up the defense of the bishop. Here again, white is threatening to checkmate with the rook, a familiar pattern we already talked about in previous lessons. Again, the challenge is how to defend that square. And the answer is the same. The bishop and the pawn are on the same diagonal. Even though the bishop doesn't need to move, it's the pawn that's in between. We need to open this diagonal. So now the pawn on h7 is protected. In our last 2 examples of this lesson, we'll see a defense method on how to stop an opponent's pawn from promoting. Here we go. In this position, we can see the white pawn on f7 being just 1 square away from promotion to f8. Anywhere the black bishop would move to, it would not stop the pawn from promoting. So therefore, what we need to recognize is that the bishop indeed is already in the right square. The problem is the king that is in its way. So therefore, the simple solution is moving the king to d5, and then if pawn promotes, the bishop will capture it. And the last example on this same theme, the challenge is the same. White's pawn about to promote, the bishop is already in place. However, this time we have 2 pawns in our bishop's way. Therefore, we need to push the one with a check first, and then push the second one, and that will guarantee to save the game. I hope you learned from these ideas, these patterns, and you will incorporate it in your own future games. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.